Now joining us are the theologian and social commentator Mohammed Ansar, Peter Neumann, the director of the International Centre for the Study of Radicalisation at King's College London, who's made a study of how to combat radicalisation, and the former Security and Counter Terrorism Minister, Dame Pauline Neville-Jones. Mohammed Ansar, this question of radicalisation seems vulnerable characters, young age, born Christian but converted, and then in the sway of this extraordinarily extreme man in Beirut. What do you make of it?
I think it's deeply worrying. I think it reflects a situation we have in society today where young Muslims are following the worst kind of teachings, the most extreme teachings, the most radical teachings, and we don't really have the infrastructure at the minute to be able to tackle this.
To some extent exacerbated by the fact that Britain has been at war effectively in Muslim lands for 12 years?
I think there's an argument to be made that Britain has been engaging in relatively unhelpful and colonial ambitions for far longer than a decade or two. However, we see the vast majority of Muslims in this country and around the world living incredibly peaceful, fruitful lives, contributing to society and well integrating. So the questions we have to ask is, what was so different about the teachings that these boys received, that these young men received, who ended up becoming killers and taking part in this heinous act?
Peter Neumann, you've made a study precisely of radicalisation. How do you read it?
Well, it seems quite clear that these people, these two guys, were part of what we call a counterculture, an extremist milieu for a number of years. There's nothing necessarily worrying about being part of an extremist milieu. What was missed was the point at which they graduated from being part of that counterculture to actually wanting to commit a violent act. That was missed to some extent by the authorities, and that should have been picked up. And what really happened over the past 3 or 4 years is that people in Al-Qaeda changed their strategy. They said, you no longer have to be part of an organized structure. You can just go out and do something on your own. Become a lone wolf. Don't wait for us to find you. Don't wait for us to train you. Just go out and do something.
What numbers are we talking about? What do you think we're looking at in the community?
I think we're looking at a couple of hundred people in this country who would be prepared to do something like that.
But more than that have gone out to fight in Syria. I mean,
yes,
300,
absolutely.
as you said. So we must be talking about many hundreds.
Yes, but I do think that fighting in Syria is something slightly different. I do think it is a more extreme act, even from an extremist point of view, to kill someone on the streets of London than go to Syria and defend what you consider to be your Sunni brothers who are being assaulted by Bashar.
Do you?
I think there's a lot of truth in that. I think the radicalisation journey for these two men.
But do you see fighting in Syria as less radical than killing somebody on a street of London?
I live in the south, and of course we have Iftikhar Jaman, who and a number of his cohorts who went out, and he was killed just. We think it was perhaps up to 2 weeks ago, or a couple of days ago, and then the information came through. The way they see it is my understanding is that they see it as their moral obligation.
No, I'm wondering how you see it.
I do see it certainly as far more extreme. Personally, I mean, I think there's very simple theological reasons within Islam why young Muslims shouldn't be going far afield to carry out these acts and be involved in these things.
Baroness Neville-Jones, there do seem to have been problems for MI5 and MI6 in terms of keeping tabs on this guys.
Well, I mean, we just heard about the numbers. And one of the things that Peter said is very relevant to why it is so difficult to know, when somebody tips over from simply being part of the shouting crowd into deciding that they're going to commit a violent act. And the modern idea about how you go and commit an atrocity is actually to go and buy some knives and go and do it. So there are not many signals come from that for the authorities to pick up.
But the problem surely is that the extreme pool from which this even more extreme behaviour flows appears to be large and extremely unpredictable.
It's certainly large. How unpredictable, I don't know. Certainly this kind of act...
Could we have predicted that people would go off and fight in Syria?
Oh, I think once Syria started, yes, I think we could predict that people from this country would go, yes. I think we'd know that. And indeed, I mean, there will be a lot of people on MI5's list of people that they have to keep on their keep on their watch list, keep on their radar. They've got to prioritise. And what we don't know in all of this, when people say perhaps they should have picked up Lee Rigby, and perhaps they should have picked up Lee Rigby, and the Security and Counter Terrorism Committee will look at that. But we don't know how much competition there was for other people that they've been looking at, where they have actually managed to prevent something terrible happening.
But in a sense, what is praiseworthy is they did have Adebayo on their wavelengths. Yeah. And what is unimpressive is they lost him.
Well, I don't know that they did lose him, but we don't. I mean, it does look as if the movement from, in his case, shouting some and preaching and doing some things which are pretty unattractive, and certainly, and I think we ought to talk about this business of extremism as distinct from violence. But it's very hard to know when you're going to tip over.
Well, how short is the journey between extremism, espousing really extreme material, and actually taking up a gun and shooting somebody?
There's not a formula. I mean, if we look at, for example, Mohammed Khan, the leader of the 7/7 cell, it took him 10 years. In these cases, it probably also took them a number of years. We also know about cases like, for example, Roshana Chowdhury, who went off to stab her MP, Stephen Timms. It only took her 3 or 4 months. So there doesn't seem to be a formula. But one thing I wanted to mention is that when it comes to these so-called lone wolves, we're often looking in the wrong places. I do think that a lot of interaction that happens that we used to be looking for in radical mosques and radical bookshops now happens on the internet. I don't think that authorities are often looking in these places. Absolutely. And I do think that we need to be more systematic, because these people are actually revealing a lot of stuff about themselves on social media, on Twitter and Facebook. And if we were to become better at picking up on that stuff, we would be able to predict some of these
part of the picture. I think what's become clear over the last few years is that even post the findings from 7/7 was that the way our intelligence services use information, the way in which we manage information, the way in which we understand the Muslim communities and even the far-right communities where radicalisation and extremist narratives are taking hold, we're using the wrong kind of agencies with a lack of credibility, a lack of capacity and a lack of understanding. So I think it's far more nuanced.
Well, what effect is Mohammed Bakri having, tipping this material out onto the internet every night out of Beirut, being watched by young, vulnerable...
Absolutely. He sits in Beirut. He is on Paltalk, which is a sort of chat room, and he addresses his supporters in London as if he was still there. That wasn't possible 20 or 30 years ago, with someone who was essentially exiled from the UK, still being able to run a group within the United Kingdom.
Well, forgive me, why isn't that being bombarded? I mean, why is that particular site not being attacked by the security services?
They do try to take sites down. It is very hard, actually, to constantly take people down. I mean, because you move on, you move on, you move on. He can find a way through every time. But all of this brings us to what we need to do, to actually get well ahead of the temptation to engage in extremism. And that's the dialogue that we need to have, and that's where we all need to move together.
This week alone, in the last week, there's been this great debate about segregation on university campuses.
Absolutely, yeah.
Well, I mean, to many of us in a secular state, that sounds an extremist position, wanting to have segregated life on a campus. I
do think that debate actually has been quite largely mischaracterised. I mean, if you went into a restaurant and certain ladies want to sit in an area and gentlemen in another area, I mean, when I give talks and lectures, I've never ever asked for people to be segregated. I wouldn't do. I think if people voluntarily want to sit in different areas, I mean, but the problem is Eton is a relatively segregated place of learning.
The problem is, what journey are we on? Britain is at war in Muslim states. That causes offence.
Absolutely. Yes.
A question of Britain is in war.
No, we're not.
We're not in war in Afghanistan. Not in war.
We're not in
Yemen,
war against
Somalia.
Muslims. We're not in war against
Muslims. But they are
Muslims.
Muslim countries.
They may be Muslim countries. And what's more, we've been in countries like in the Balkans, where you've actually gone in to help specifically
how is that read?
Muslim
How is that
community
read by these extremists?
Well, quite clearly, extremists read it in the way you just described it, which is that the West is at war with Islam, and that's why it is so important.
I didn't express it like that. I said they're Muslim countries.
Exactly.
But the clash of civilization narrative is sold by both.
But that's why it's so important that we don't play into that narrative, and that we make it very clear that we're not in these countries to fight against Islam. We're there to address certain concerns about people who attacked us, but we're not at war with that religion.
The government does have to be prepared.
That's quite nuanced, and you've got to ask a rather complex community to think about that. But Peter Neumann, I have to leave it there, but thank you very much for joining us. Mohammed Ansar too, and Baroness Pauline Neville-Jones, thank you very much.